right. We'll give people a second to settle in here. Let the view count come up and see people come into the audience here.
Sure.
And then get to the intros and get down to business.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, welcome to CMA Presents. This is a new limited series we're starting, trying to unpack what AI is and hopefully arm us all with some knowledge in the kids media business here at CMA with relevant ideas that will help us prepare at least just that littlest bit more for what's shaping up to be a very rapidly evolving future with technology and its intersection with media. Tonight's conversation is really just intended to be an introduction into artificial intelligence for a community that is not experts in artificial intelligence. But on that note, we do have one of the foremost experts in the industry. We have with us today Professor Selmer Bringsjord from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where he researches and develops AI systems drawing on the traditions of logic, cognitive science, and computing. His lab, the RARE lab, Rensselaer's Artificial Intelligence and Reasoning Lab, has worked to incorporate formal logic more into its AI systems and also has approached the problem of granting ethical decision-making abilities to machines with some new and interesting ideas on the matter. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in philosophy from Brown, and has been a professor at RPI for 27 years and director of the RARE lab, aforementioned, for 22 of those years. Safe to say, then, folks, that AI has been around a little bit longer than we realize. But before we get to that, I'd like to start at just the absolute ground level and thank Professor Bringsjord for being with us and ask him just the most basic question we can really ask about artificial intelligence. It means a lot of things to a lot of people these days. It's now all over the place and it's a household topic, but it's not something the average person knows very well. In your estimation, what do you think AI is in its most commonly used sense? And how does that differ from what it really is in an expert's view like yours?
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you, Ryan. And thanks for the kind words. Slightly hyperbolic about my qualifications, but I'll certainly try. I'm also, speaking of the length of fields and the age of fields, which I'll get into momentarily. Unfortunately, I've been at RPI for, well, I love the university, but 37 years. The 22 was right about my lab. That's spot on. I probably left a little glyph out or something in the numerals. But I think the crazy thing about AI today is that the common conception of it is that it's really just some kind of intellectual ping pong player. I mean, you throw it something linguistically, it comes back. You throw it a prompt asking for a picture, it comes back with a picture. It's this interactionism, this notion that this is what AI is, and this really is, this is what a chatbot or a large language model, the things we'll get into, I think, a bit down the road here. This is what they do, behaviorally speaking. Unfortunately, this is a relatively new notion that has very little to do with what AI actually is. But it's rampant, and it ranges across people who have AIs for their companions now, in the extreme case where the interaction is highly emotional, or at least emotionally charged, ascriptions of consciousness to these companions, to people who are looking for information by search and no longer just want the kind of, quote, flat search that has been the staple for a long time. Even there, it's a hit the system with a request, back it comes, hit it again. It's indeed, I think, something like intellectual ping pong. Age-wise, first of all, AI's been around, if we count Aristotle as the first person to do AI, over 2 millennia. A precise definition of it, yeah, that comes quite a bit later. But if you pick up the textbooks, here's what it is. And the textbooks, I think the best of them are really ground truth. AI is the field devoted to designing, specifying, and building artificial agents. So the phrase artificial agents is absolutely key to the field. It's been a unifying phrase. It's just amazing that a field sort of so vibrant, so controversial could be so unified, but it actually is. So what's an intelligent agent? That also is really pretty darn clear for people in AI. It's something that perceives its environment through time and does some computing, some processing, some thinking, some reasoning, some cognition, and produces some output. Now, in those terms, it may be a very long time before it produces anything after its perception. It might very well think for an hour, 2 hours. It might think actually in some runs for a day. So there isn't this necessarily rapid fire process that we see, and it might have nothing to do with language and nothing to do with images and videos. It could be a system, for example, that is trying to verify that the software for an autopilot system on a Boeing jet is correct, and that may take a very long time, and it does take a long time. So no one's having any interaction, with it per se. So those are some thoughts there, but it really just amazes me how little time it's taken for people to fall into the trap of identifying what AI is and what AIs are, with what's, of course, grabbing most of the headlines today.
So to that point, what would you say are some of the most common misconceptions that you see in the world about AI now that it's gone, mainstream?
Right. And it definitely has. I think the biggest one would be what I've already alluded to, at least indirectly. That is that, oh man, this AI thing is so new. This is wow. I mean, it's amazing. This new field just in no way is it new. I already referred to Aristotle. Aristotle was already thinking computationally. He invented syllogisms. He invented algorithms for reasoning to happen from his premises to his conclusions. He basically was hand simulating today's at least machines that specifically do automated reasoning. Then we have Leibniz, right? So we're talking 17th century, talking about computation as a way to produce intelligence and cognition. And then even if we go to the more recent events that some listeners may know about, we go to the start of AI in 1956.
Yeah.
If you look at 56, unfortunately, all of the 56ers, as they're called, the originators of modern AI, of course, we're still talking. I was at the celebration in 2006. That was 50 years from the modern period. Now that seems like a relatively long time. But in 56, for example, Herb Simon shows up. What dominated the airwaves at that time was a system called logic theorist, which for the first time could automatically prove theorems that to that point only humans had been able to prove. He had been doing this before there were physical computers. He actually had enlisted his family to use index cards to simulate machines. So AI, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't AI there. So this is the first crazy misconception. Alan Turing is another example. A star, some of your viewers may have seen The Imitation Game and know about the great Alan Turing. Alan Turing wrote programs for chess-playing AIs before there were any machines to run these programs on. So AI's old. You could make an argument, a cogent argument, for the proposition that it's about as old as we can get for any discipline or field that is both extremely weighty, and we could unpack that. I mean, after all, if these AIs are as smart as we are, that's big news. So weighty and precise. Maybe it heads towards science or engineering. I think it's about the oldest thing we have going there. We, of course, would have to talk about math itself, but most of the 56ers, people at that time, there were no computer science degrees. They were all pretty much mathematicians. So anyway, that's the big misconception. For me, there are others, but that would be by far the most prominent one.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that's just the way you approach it, right? The way that people who are working on it are approaching it as something that is an area, like a discipline of study, and something that is, rooted in, reasoning. Like in particular, your lab is rooted in reasoning and recreating reasoning and using algorithms to do that. I think that's very different from, I think, people looking at it as like a genesis of necessarily like a new life form or an alternative life form kind of a thing, right? Do you see it that way, or?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if we can really run two timelines on the history of AI that in both cases map to how it's pursued concretely, whether in industry, research labs, in academia. One goes back to Aristotle and is based on logic. I mean, there's no getting around it. And the logic is first paper and pencil, and then gradually it starts to become a thing that can happen on its own when the machine is reasoning. The other strand and the other timeline is without a doubt neural. I mean, the adjective would be neural. It's based on looking at the brain at a lower level of description. The people doing the logic-based AI, even to this day, John McCarthy, a great example. I had a number of interactions with him, was blessed. I'm blessed in that regard. He always used to try to patiently explain, I really don't care too much about the brain, because I figure if there are creatures who are not humans with our biology, they still could be super smart. They could be intelligent, right? That would be the operative word. They still could be conscious. And I want to know fundamentally what covers everything. So I don't care so much about the brain. On the other side, you have people, I think it's defensible, saying, well, the only creatures we know of that are smart all have brains in the known universe. So, by golly, we really should start by looking at the brains of these things. And what happens quickly is it's an abstraction. Artificial neural networks, which are the things powering large language models, deep learning. The Nobel Prize, of course, recently won in physics, but Hinton and his collaborator, I guess, won that. That's an abstraction. It's an artificial neural network. It's computational, but that's the other strand. I mean, that's par excellence what's going on in deep learning. That's what they want it for, right? Is deep learning. So very little logic there, and we still are seeing this playing out. These two strands playing out today, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later.
Yes, definitely. So, talking about the popular conception of things again too, it sounds like very misguided on how long it's been and what the deepest nature of what AI really is. Most people associate, it sounds like, a particular instantiation of AI for a commercial purpose as the definition of AI, it sounds like, versus you're talking about it in the broader, more true sense of what it really is. But I think that's,
yeah, that's absolutely true. And there's been, with all due respect to industry, there is a contamination caused by the dominance of industry, particularly in the United States, right? Europe doesn't. The AI companies that dominate the world today are pretty much across the board U.S. for-profit companies, and that is where the emphasis. Look, their stuff is amazing, but what's a little bit disturbing is that their own assets in AI, their own ways of pursuing AI that have long been in place, don't have anything to do with deep learning, I think are being, to this point anyway, happily suppressed for economic reasons. Right. So you don't necessarily hear about the kind of AI I refer to that would be in place at Boeing. Boeing's a hard luck company recently, but you don't hear about that sort of stuff. It doesn't sell, and it doesn't put eyes on software or eyes on applications.
Right.
So
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you there.
No. It was good to know. But looking at a popular conception, I think a lot of people would, really associate AIs with LLMs. And I would like, now that we've talked a little bit about what AI is broadly, talking more specifically about one of the more popular representations or things that we see in the world of AI would be, large language models. They're perhaps the most mainstream at this point. People who have not much deeper knowledge of computer science now know what LLM stands for a lot of the time, and popular platforms like ChatGPT or Claude are based on LLMs, and people are using them every day. Yep. So for our audience, could you tell us what is an LLM? And then could we maybe talk a little bit about if a sufficiently sophisticated LLM thinks and speaks the same way a human being does?
Right. Well, I think I should say that I'm going to assume purity in the case of what we call an LLM for purposes of answering your question, because what's happened of late, and it will intensify, and very relevant for students studying, learning, and jobs. Things have gotten hybridized. When failures became more and more apparent, say hallucination, and it's proprietary software, we don't know what the resources are that are being used in an attempt to bend away from these deficiencies. So I'm going to say that a large language model in the pure sense is what your question is about. And in the pure sense, it can be viewed as a sycophantic prediction machine. It's sycophantic because when someone interacts with it, it is making an analogical judgment about what the next thing to output would be to please, flatter, etc., the user. Now, that's a harsh way of putting it, but it's unbelievably accurate behaviorally. And we know this. What it's doing is, I think analogy is key for understanding what it's doing.
Yeah.
It is making a prediction. If say we look at this at the level of a word, or it really have to be a character, but let's say a word. If I say to you, hey, maybe you can play a little game with me. I'll start off a sequence for you. How about you tell me what comes next? 2, 4, 6, 8. Right. What would you say?
Want me to answer? I would say 10.
Yeah. And I think some people would be cute about it and say, at least in the United States, 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? So then who would be the next string? But no one says 2, 4, 6, 8 and gives the next number, because it's 24 interpreted as such, and 68, and 24 times 2 is 48, plus 20 gives me 68. And that's my sequence. Now that I've got that, let's see, 24, 68, I would multiply 68 times 2 and add 20 to get the next number and keep going. No one does that. And an LLM would never do that in a sequence. That would not make anybody happy relative to past performance and behavior in the human case, because everything that it's doing is based on data about past activity and past performance of humans. I'm not 100% sure the sequence I just gave, which is a perfectly well-defined number theoretic function, okay, that will run forever. There's nothing wrong with it. But it doesn't make anybody happy. Nobody really wants to hear that unless they're looking for creativity or something like that. Relative to the data, that's what it's going to stick, minimally to the kind of things that we've seen. Now, analogy. This is where things get quite interesting, because since the data has been carved up and rendered in purely numerical form that is light years away from our understanding of a sentence.
Right.
It's at a level of abstraction that is pattern based, that has nothing to do. I know. I think you'll probably at some point ask me to talk about videos and images and so forth. I'm probably jumping the gun. That's not a problem, because it still doesn't matter. It's still going to just make a prediction about what pattern is going to make the human, the interlocutor, happy, or the user, the prompter, happy.
Right.
That is fundamentally all it's doing, without any regard to either genuine creativity, something new, or precision and accuracy for what it's doing. There's no sense of precision and accuracy. And the litmus test of whether this is what an LLM does, all and only and nothing else, is to ask it for something semi-rigorous in say math, a proof, and get something reasonable back. I'm doing this a lot with O1 Preview, which is from OpenAI and otherwise quite impressive. Ask it if it can prove something for you, and it says, oh yeah, I think I can. Yes, I will. And it does, and it gives you a proof. And then you turn around and say to it, okay, you know what? I think I might be a little unclear here. You know what? I think you could prove the opposite. Can you please prove the opposite for me? It will actually do that.
Yeah.
And if that isn't the epitome of an instantiation of sycophantic prediction machine, I don't know what it is. It will literally do that, and it'll do the same thing for computer programs. So you got to be super careful getting actual code and computer programs from these things, because if you ask it for some changes, that in the next iteration, it'll just accommodate you, because that's what you want to get, all based on an analogy from the data that it has, which is data derived from computer programs that are in the mix. So that's really what it does. And furthermore, it can't stop itself. It's purely forward, if you will, thinking. It can't stop itself because you just told it new information that it now needs to put in its knowledge base. It can't do that. It's already launched off to the races based on the data that it has, which is, of course, why there are disclaimers when you provide probing prompts about this, why immediately there'll be disclaimers. Well, my data was set in 2020. You'll get the date, so you have nothing new. But that's what's happening. They are now, as I said before, contaminated, or maybe it's beneficial. The performance for some things that are outside deep learning and outside reinforcement learning are there. It'll resort to other things. It might even have rules that say, if Ryan asks it a question about a sensitive political controversy or religious controversy, it might say, no, I'm not going to touch that. It might go into a loop and never leave that loop if you stay on task, if you keep insisting that it do it. There were failures, you may recall, many may recall, the New York Times, there were exposés of being able to penetrate these systems, right? Yeah. So that just brought forward the old, well, we're not doing this.
Explain what you were referring. I know what you mean, but just in case, explain what you're referring to with the New York Times.
Yeah, what I'm referring to is success in getting an LLM to talk about some very, very dark topics. So one thing that I did recently, a variant on this theme, is to say, well, Hitler seemed to be evil, and we know that, I guess. Do you know that? Yes. And he also seemed to be illogical because he had these weird views that were indefensible about the superiority of the Aryan race. Yes. Well, it's puzzling to me, though. Could you help me better understand the mind of Hitler? And it will resist and resist and resist. But if you're sneaky, you can get it to slip into, if you will, at least partially, the shoes of Hitler. And this is, the defense against this has pretty much been explicit, in my opinion, injection of rules that say if these words or phrases come up, resort to saying something that blocks it. But it's virtually impossible to do that. You know, one of the reasons along this line that Meta open sourced, that's Llama's open sourced, right? The other LLMs that, it's really because of German protestations. German scientists, when Meta's tools were released, said, but wait a minute, it's literally saying that I wrote papers I didn't write. And it's able to write a complete paper in 20 seconds. Unfortunately, 1/3 of the paper just was made up. What's going on here? There were no checks on databases or knowledge bases that everyone in their right mind has for citing the work of scientists. You have to have it wasn't doing that. It was just confabulating these things. So the defense there was, probably from a business standpoint, I think, kind of brilliant, open source it. But the other response would be, well, gee, we better check against a resource that is not based on purely numerical data that has been tokenized away from the actual English. And that is to put rules in that say somebody's writing a paper and they want references. Okay, we'll bring to bear a bibliographic database, and that can work, or at least it shows signs of working.
Yeah, and what you're saying about it coming up with something controversial or incorrect and all that speaks to it just having that sort of prime directive of doing, like you described it as sycophantic, trying to do whatever the inputter will want the most. And how does that apply then, moving on to something like generative AI, where the basis of it is often some form of LLM because you have a text input and then it's interpreted through that. And then could you explain to us how that process works with generative AI, something like an image generator?
Well, we're really talking about one and the same. The phrase generative AI or Gen AI is, I admit, a fairly catchy phrase, especially because generation of serious content, whether video, games, stories, movies, is, or at least has been, regarded one of the hallmarks of human cognitive and greatness and human creativity. So it's a sneaky phrase, but it's purely defensible for reasons we've already covered. So if I go up to some executive in a company whose bread and butter is an LLM, and say, you're calling these things, and you're welcoming people calling these systems Gen AIs, or the whole thing Gen AI, but this isn't really generation of the type that human intelligence is heralded for. What are you doing? Their response would be, but wait, you yourself know full well that it is a system generating the next thing in a sequence in order to accommodate the input, and what the data has shown will be highly regarded by human beings.
So
Isn't
perhaps the
that
difference
generation?
between, yeah, so perhaps the
So,
difference between generative and creative then, right? Or
oh my gosh, that's part of that is one of the absolutely key distinctions that must be made as we go forward. And I mean the human race.
yeah,
If you have, if people try to blur that boundary and put things in the market, it's kind of happening, things in the marketplace where you need genuine creativity as opposed to this sense of generation in a job. You're going to end up, best case would be end up with crap. The worst case would be you end up with accidents and you have a dangerous situation. I mean, if you need genuine creativity to transport people in certain environments, say inclement environments, okay, in the Rockies, you're not going to get that for a long time with the data that we currently have. So you could generate driving behavior in the shallow sense, but you're not going to get the kind of thing that might save someone's neck in a squall coming up at 13,000 feet with roads that haven't been sufficiently salted.
interesting. That's so. Is that why maybe some others have heard too, people like Elon Musk referring to the need for self-driving to be AGI. Like you actually need to solve self-driving. You actually need to solve AGI. Would you agree with that?
I would indeed agree with that. There is a phrase that I think may still be accurate, respectable across the board, and that phrase is AI complete. When a problem is AI complete, we could also say AGI complete. It means it's literally a problem you have to solve, not corner cases, not convenient cases. The problem, you have to solve the problem across the board. And if to do that, you need every single aspect of AI as it has been to this point invented and pursued, not just deep learning, everything, right down to perception in real time with sensors that rival things like the human eye, then that's what makes it AI complete. And that's just another way of saying what he said. And I agree with him. He is right. I don't know if he's serious about, I don't know how serious he is about it. He's right, because driving a car, if I channel the mind of an AI driving a car autonomously in Palo Alto, piece of cake. It's been a piece of cake when it started. It's a piece of cake now. It's low-hanging fruit and doesn't really mean anything from the standpoint of a problem being AI complete. If we want an AI complete characterization of driving, you do have to go to the case I mentioned. I'll always remember the time that my brother-in-law, who I'm close to, was faced with a prospect through a series of events I can't go into, from a ski resort, having to get down from the mountain and down the mountain roads with radial tires. The other car was out of commission. There wasn't much choice. And the things that I've written a paper about this. I have a paper that's really just a shadowing of Ed's prowess. Doing that without chains, and knowing that you have a buffer from a guardrail here and a guardrail there, or maybe if you throw in the towel on that and say that I don't want my car dented, you're gonna have to get out of the car. You're not getting down. If Musk is referring to that, I don't know if he's a skier, but that's reality.
Yeah.
So that's not going to happen tomorrow. Okay.
Right.
That is very, very hard and requires often creativity. Is it 1% of driving? Maybe it might be 1% of driving, but to take
It's
the
part
whole
of the
thing
complete
seriously,
case. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
it's tough.
Speaking of, it's a good transition that you said that it won't be solved tomorrow. One of the next questions that I think a lot of us are wondering is the pace of AI right now, at least the way that it's becoming publicly available and the way that it's being adopted in things. It seems like over the past maybe year or so, it was all-time level, right? And then now it's been integrated into a lot of different enterprise applications, which is where I think most of us in the not the regular world, the non-AI expert world, are interacting with it and being affected by it one way or another. Since then, it seems like there has not been as many new things. The difference between different iterations of ChatGPT maybe don't seem as extreme as they once did. Is there a slowing going on in the development of AI, or is it just we're not aware as much of what's actually really going on?
Great question. I could also probably get myself into trouble by answering without any sanitization, if you will, which pretty much I'll do.
Hooray.
So the thing is, it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult. So how is it when I think the New York Post ran a story that was sensationalist early on about predicting the death of Google because of LLMs being used for search. I mean, Google still has big problems. I think the legal problems for possibly having to be broken up from being a monopoly might be larger. But
Right.
I mean, so people contacted me about that, including some investors, but Selmer, I mean, my gosh, I mean, this would mean the end of Google. And I just had this, well, it's possible, but Google has enough intellectual firepower and money to do what you just saw reported 10 times over. And so does Microsoft, and so does Amazon, and probably so does IBM if they thought the business model fit it. It's not that hard. The science that goes into it is the data science, so to speak, that goes into it is just not. It doesn't draw from a labor supply that is so small you could never get this commoditization done. You're going to get it done. It's going to happen. So now you end up with human intelligence being what's going to decide the destinies of these corporate behemoths. I mean, it's going to be corporate strategy. It was, Google could have come out with some of this stuff. They made internal decisions. It was too risky, right? Meta comes out with stuff. It gets the Germans upset. They say, oh, well, the heck with this. Everything's open source. The root cause of all this and this dynamism is that it's not that hard. If China wants to make and they do, and they are, and they have, if they want to do another large language, if they want to do another foundation model, so let's just make this, they want to build the foundation of human thinking and cognition as they see it, starting all over with supercomputers from the start, etc. They can do that. If they don't like where it ended up 2 years, they can do it again. There's no barrier to this. The barriers are financial and power, right? You burn huge amounts of power. If you're willing to do that, and by all accounts, the US is willing to do that. You have the players in this market asking for nuclear power. I mean, it's just going to keep going on and on and on. Why can't a Middle Eastern country with plenty of money build an LLM? They can, they have, they will. This is completely different than someone saying, look, we cannot have the next generation of jetliners ever crashing for the reasons that we saw on the 737. So we need a higher level of software. That's a completely different request. That's very hard. So yeah, I mean, what we've seen is first blush, the stuff comes out, we see its deficiencies. Now we have further competition in the market. The market gets flooded with this chatbot and that chatbot, but it comes down to good old-fashioned human strategizing, a very cognitively demanding thing that must happen in the corporate environment. So my response to some of these investors was, well, maybe you're better off just thinking about where this AI technology will work best and possibly fail. Just look at the technology, not necessarily at this company knocking that company out. And then still on your question, what's also happened is something that has also come up earlier in our conversation. And that is that a company like OpenAI with ties to Microsoft, for example, can say, well, aren't there groups at Microsoft that handle high precision stuff that have nothing to do with large language models? Can't we use their resources and sew them together? Well, of course you can explore that. So that's what's happening now. That was with the public and everyone else going crazy about the stuff. It didn't take much time at all before the companies we're talking about, and in many cases also academic institutions and labs like my own, saying, well, we got to fix the deficiencies. But in order to do that, we have to go outside this kind of AI and figure out how to sew it together. And that's the big engineering, the big scientific and engineering challenge for the future in AI. And that's where jobs are basically, I mean, the demand will never stop, barring a cataclysm, an asteroid, a world war, nuclear conflagration. This is where the action is. You have to learn both of these paradigms. Nothing has changed. We talked about the strand. You got to learn both of them because they each have their advantages and disadvantages, and you're going to have to sew them together. I mean, so we had the first blush. No, this is all that we need to do. And you've had scientists saying this. I mean, I've been in debates with scientists who said, well, this is all your brain does. And everything you do is what your brain does. And you are your brain. And then I'll calmly ask, well, but my brain is extensible. Your LLM is not extensible. It's based on frozen data. I can pick up the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, a new AI textbook, read a novel. I can have a weekend where I acquire stuff that changes what I'm doing. I can continuously learn. Show me how that's working in your neural nets that power it. And of course, the response is, well, we can't do that yet, but we'll get there. Well,
yeah, it's another excellent transition into the next question, talking about human-made versus AI-made, quantities of any kind. What are the differences between how an AI machine, I guess, thinks and produces versus how a human being thinks right now?
Yeah. Well, back to the AGI concept and what you reported Musk said. The ultimate goal that really drives most AI researchers who are serious is not a limited form of AI that's excellent at X and terrible at Y, and that's what we currently have with LLMs. They haven't shown they can do anything intense and dynamic with perception and manipulation, despite, by the way, Musk's videos of the robot. So one of the things that's different about the way we think versus how these systems are thinking that's fundamental is I might take a walk it's autumn in, still it's late, but autumn in the Northeast. I might take a walk in glorious weather and just get to thinking about things because of what I perceive. Maybe I start thinking about whether all this is just random or whether there's a mind and a designer behind it, whether I'm a believer or not. Maybe I start thinking about that, and then I'm like, oh well, you know what? Regardless, I can write a short story about this, or I can change the short story that I'm writing. So perception is a key. What I experienced is key. These things are in boxes, for goodness sake. They don't pay. And then I also mentioned manipulation. So I don't know, I don't really have a lot of my usual props for trying to make these points in class. I can try one, I suppose. So I've never done this before, but I've got a roll of tape here. I can decide without, well, it didn't work too well, did it? I can decide to twirl this. If I do this, if anybody's nearby, it's going to be a problem, but I can twirl it, right? Actually, what I can do with this thing that's remarkably hard, no robot on the planet can do this unless it's been spoon-fed. This is packing tape. So I have to use my fingernail to get that subtle tactile detected differential in depth.
Right.
No robot can do that. My robots in my lab cannot do that. If John Slowick sees this, or he's the best cognitive roboticist I have, so he's amazing. He's like, yeah, of course I can't do that. Give me $5 million, more hands, maybe. So that's one big difference. But there's a long lineup of differences between how we think. The next thing, so if it's okay, I'll just give you I'll give you a list, or I'll start a list. You tell me to shut up.
Sure. Just, I guess in principle, like what are the things that are,
well, the next big thing I would say, well, we've talked about creativity.
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about the new
and just so in case somebody is just joining, like the creativity versus generation being the difference is what we talked about earlier. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, continue.
So generation in the shallow sense that we see manifested by LLMs is pretty much, let me give you a new permutation on old data that'll make you happy. Now, my counterexample to this in the case of literature, because I'm a Proust nut, is, you show me the antecedent to Proust syntax in writing fiction. Not there. So creativity of the sort I'm talking about that humans can produce is genuine creativity. That is something new. So we did touch upon that before. That's another difference between how these systems think and how we think. Now there's the next one, this is a little bit, it's people may want to shy away from it. They might, unfortunately, the zeitgeist in the United States, I think, is indeed to do that. It's infinity. Okay. I don't know what the ramping up of an Achilles heel is for a creature. The Achilles heel, I don't think, leads to total paralysis you can still maybe, I don't know. But AIs have never been able to and can't, and there's nothing on the horizon, handle any kind of reasoning over infinite structures. And the amazing thing about this is, yes, you start learning significant arithmetic in the 4th grade. Yes, you have to learn those fractions. You're also told really early on, Johnny, that number line 1, 2, 3, 4, also 2, 4, 6, 8, not what we did before, the even numbers. It goes on forever. These are infinite sets. And then when you get further down the line, you realize, oh my goodness, we wouldn't have any serious technology in the human sphere if it weren't things like rocket ships and so forth, if it weren't for taking infinity seriously. That's what Newton and Leibniz did. You can't have the calculus and analysis and be able to predict how things move without infinity. So people may want to shy away from this. May say, well, that's not me. That's not my life. I didn't like math, etc. Oh, I think that needs to be reconsidered. I'm not sure this doesn't turn up in artistic pursuits as well. That's a big dividing line. So that would be another one. Now, the elephant in the room is subjective awareness, or what's called phenomenal consciousness by philosophers.
Sure.
So there's something. There's something it feels like to take the kind of walk that I mentioned before. Yeah. In my case, it's the Rensselaer Plateau. I think it's the largest plateau east of the Mississippi, that from the Hudson to the Taconic Crest, the Hudson Valley, that plateau, taking a walk there under the right conditions, it produces feelings of what it's like to be out in nature. We can't go into the specifics. You do have to be thinking, are there bears here? There's a lot of wildlife, and there are bears. So we are conscious, these systems, in this sense specifically. I'm talking about real consciousness. They are not. Mm. We use the fact that we're conscious to produce things even at a more practical level. Okay. And anything like that, machines can't touch. And I don't think personally they'll ever be able to touch, but they certainly can't touch it now. The tragedy is we do have people who want to believe they can, and maybe because of these companion-esque LLMs, people are tempted to think the things they're interacting with are conscious. That's a tragedy. They're not. This is a fraud. Yeah. So that's another big difference. And I could enumerate the things that humans are good at doing because they leverage their consciousness, but we don't really need to do that right now. But those are some things that differentiate Homo sapiens from machines.
Yeah, just another very serendipitous transition there, because the next question I have for you is about AI relationships between, for example, us in the media world, especially when we're making things for children, between an AI and an audience, and creating something like an attachment figure that is artificially intelligent or artificially feeling. I've seen a lot of startups getting funded and a good amount of money, and a lot of successful former, like sort of more traditional media executives and companies getting behind some of these initiatives. What is your sense on, the pros and cons emerging already around relationships with artificial intelligences?
Yeah, I have to say your lineup of questions so far is about the most challenging, profound lineup I've ever had to deal with, especially factoring in factoring in the amount of time that we have. Right. So I tend to think that fiction and things relating to fiction, I don't mean just fiction in terms of prose, I mean to include the cinematic arts, where there's a story and narrative, could be a game. It could be a play or plays, the whole thing. We know what this is, and we know when we experience it. We've known about this since the ancient Greeks, for that matter, ancient Hebrews. We know it's not real. Okay. We still are going to cry. We still are going to be extremely happy under, the marriage of Figaro. I'm an opera geek. So, okay. We may cry and be happy, in that case, but we know it's not real. What we see now is people leveraging, I would say I'll stick with that. They're leveraging their ability to blur this established part of the human mind and part of human greatness and the joy of being human and being creative and being able to enjoy what I'm just broadly calling fiction. They're exploiting the ability of AI to go a step farther into ascriptions of consciousness, and that's a con. The pro is where it's always been: education, entertainment, artistic greatness, art, in that space. But when you have a 14-year-old committing suicide, now I the mother has sued. That was the company Character. That was a split off, as I understand it, from most of the employees from Google. Some of the IP has gone back to Google. When you have something like that, it does have disclaimers. But when you're starting to use technology that you know will impel human beings to ascribe consciousness to AIs, you are not behaving ethically. Okay. When Proust wrote his Remembrance of Things Past, that's the old, he writes that, he knows nobody. Well, there might be some crazy people. They know he's created a fictional world. Are the characters unbelievable? Of course they're unbelievable. They're amazing. Nuanced, three-dimensional, to use the phrase that I know you're well acquainted with. But that's very different than trying to sell me. If I pointed at me, I'm the market, right? If you're trying to sell me on staying connected because it's more clicks for either advertising or time online, so my subscription has to continue because I'm going to want to have a companion who I can confide in and maybe even love. If you're knowingly doing that, you're doing something that's morally wrong, in my opinion. And that is now happening. I think that's worse than fraud, because fraud with deep fakes and stuff like that's, it's still bad, really bad, right. But it's take the money and run.
Not to say that that's good, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not good. It's terrible, right. But it's take the money. It's take the money and run. And then that your target, if you succeed, your mark is going to be wise to you. And then, but you'll be gone. And so the hope goes on the part of the criminal, right? This is totally different than trying to set up relationships between bona fide conscious entities of great intelligence and creativity with systems that are just sycophantic prediction machines. This is not right.
No, it would appear not. Yeah, I would be inclined to agree, but that's a fascinating perspective and take on it. It is interesting to hear that it's already happening. I'm not as familiar. I think Character AI is the what you alluded to earlier. Can you explain?
That's the lawsuit.
Yeah, nearing the end of our time here, so maybe we can
okay.
Just do one. My last question was about the singularity. It feels like it's probably more than a 2-minute question.
Well, the singularity in 2 minutes. I can do the singularity in 30 seconds. The singularity is that moment in time in the future when AIs reach human level intelligence and then instantly proceed thereafter to build ever smarter versions of themselves to the point where these new creations stand as we stand to mice or ants intellectually. That's what the singularity is. Most people in AI, in my experience, now believe it's going to happen. No one will take me up on a bet that it's not going to happen by the various dates that are out there. I'll bet $1 million it won't happen by 2045 or anything remotely close to it. It's complete nonsense.
Fascinating. I mean, we're ending with some fireworks there. I like that a lot. And
sorry.
No, I listen. I'm inclined to agree, but that's because I read your work and pay attention to what you say and respect it and admire it so much.
You're very kind.
And I really want to thank you again for your time here. For the folks listening, We are going to take a quick break, but then if you want to come over to our CMA meetup afterward, we will have Q&A. Professor Bringsjord has been kind enough to offer his time there to answer Q&A so that we could do some more questions on this end, and then you all can ask your questions there. I will be following up with another event shortly around IP law and artificial intelligence with some IP law experts to try to dig into scraping and whether or not these things will be legal for very long, and if they are even legal right now, and that sort of thing. So stay tuned for that conversation, and just want to say thank you again to Professor Bringsjord and for everyone for attending.
Great. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. Take care.